请各位贵宾将你的手机转成静音或者是震动，谢谢。Welcome to 2025 Fairwind Lecture, Trump, Xi, and the Battle for a Global Order, hosted by Fairwind Foundation. My name is Yongqi Shen, and I'm currently a master's student at Tsinghua University. It's my pleasure to be your facilitator. Today, we are honored to have Professor Rana Mitter, a renowned scholar from Harvard Kennedy School, as our distinguished speaker. Before we get started, let's welcome the moderator, the chairman of the Fairwind Foundation, Yihua Zhang, to give us an opening address. Let's give a big hand to the Chairman Zhang.
Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the event organized by the Fairwind Foundation, TVBS, and the Storm Media. Today's topic is about Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, and their battle for the global order. It is our great honor to have two distinguished scholars here today to share their views about the returning of Donald Trump to the White House and the possible development of the relation between China and the United States. I think the importance of the topic is so obvious that I do not need any elaboration. But I would like to take the opportunity to introduce you the two speakers of today's event. Our first speaker and the keynote speaker will be Professor Rana Mitter. Professor Rana Mitter is the STD chair in U.S.-Asian relations at Harvard Kennedy School. Before joining Kennedy School, he was a professor and the chair of China Study Center at Oxford University in the UK. Professor Mitter is a worldwide renowned scholar on the study of modern Chinese history. Among his many, many books, I would like to mention two of them because both of them have been translated into Chinese. The first one is Forgotten Allies, 被遗忘的盟友. The subtitle of the book is China's World War II, 1937 to 1945. This book is a very important document about the role of the Republic of China during the Second World War. And the so-called Forgotten Ally refer to our own country, the Republic of China. Unfortunately, it is something that has always been ignored or overlooked by the West, and sometimes even by our own president of the country. The book is so great that the book won a very important award, which is Lucy Duke of Westminster Award for military literature. And it was also named the best book of the year by The Economist and the Financial Times. The second book I would like to introduce to you is China's Good War, 正义之战. Again, the subtitle of the book is How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. Well, again, it is a book about the Second World War and the role of the Republic of China. But the difference is that it is talking about what is currently happening in mainland China, because the memory of the Second World War, especially the war between China and Japan, is now used by the Communist Party of China to boost and consolidate some kind of nationalism nowadays. So these two books are very, very important. And because of his academic achievement, Professor Mitter was also awarded the 2020 Medical Medal for the service to history. And he is, of course, a member of the British Academy. It's very wonderful, and we are very glad to have you here. And our second speaker today is Professor Wu Yusan. Professor Wu is my old good friend. Professor Wu is himself an academician at the Academic Sinica, and he is actually the founding director of the Institute of Political Science at the Academic Sinica. And he is also jointly appointed as the professor of political science at the National Taiwan University. Professor Wu's specialty is in comparative politics, especially about the study of the political and economic transition of former socialist countries such as Russia and some other Eastern European countries. But he is also very good at the study of constitutional regime such as semi-presidentialism and also the theories of international relations and cross-strait relations. When I was preparing their background introduction, I find one thing which is very, very interesting. Both of the two speakers are actually interdisciplinary intellectuals. They have a very strong interest in the connection between history and political science. Professor Mitter is himself an historian, but as you can see, he has been able to expand in his study of history into the field of political science, especially international politics. But on the other hand, Professor Wu Yusan is now leading a group which will be focused on the relation of history and international relations. So given the two very, very bright intellectuals and scholars today, I believe their presentation and their dialogue will be very, very inspiring. And now, let's begin with the first part. And please join me in welcoming Professor Mitter.
It's a great pleasure. Oh, sorry. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today at this part of the National Zhengzhi University to speak on behalf of the Fair Winds Foundation. And I'm also very grateful to all of you for coming here on a Saturday afternoon here in Taipei, when you could be out at the movies maybe or a ball game, and instead come and hear a talk about geopolitics. I'm also very grateful that you're willing today to let me speak in English. I know that all of you here, I suspect, are very fluent speakers of English, but nonetheless, I consider it a great privilege that you're willing to let me speak in a language where I think I can be more fluent in terms of what I have to say. But I will start, if I may, with a few comments which I hope to offer in Chinese as well to show how pleased I am to be here. So let me say, 我真的很高兴来台北来长风基金会，我很荣幸能够参加一场非常精彩的讨论。张董事长，谢谢你。我有3点我要说，我们本次论坛的主题是大国体系竞争环视协调。今天我想讲3点。第一，首先，在漫长的历史中， 竞争与协调是相结合的，这很正常。我觉得这个是真的问题是竞争能不能管理。第二，有一些问题显然非常重要，因此协调至关重要。最明显的是气候变化，人工智能是另一个。第三，在全球南方崛起的时代，那个 Global South， 大国控制体系的能力比冷战时气要小得多。所以这些3点我要强调，可是强调的方法就是说英文的，所以我觉得这个还可以。And I know that sometimes I can speak quite fast in English. So 如果你觉得我说的太快，你说慢走，告诉我，我慢一下。I think we all know that in the present day, we are living in a time of tremendous change in international order. It's clear that the United States and China have become and will remain the most powerful actors in international politics for many, many years to come, possibly even decades, but that also at this particular moment, with the arrival of a new American administration with a very different way of doing politics, either compared to the Cold War or the post-Cold War era, and a China which continues to have global influence, but whose economic, security, and international policies more broadly are still changing quite rapidly. In this situation, there is, as the title that Chairman Jiang has given us for today, a battle for global order, or at the very least, an extremely robust and not always friendly discussion. And what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about the various areas, the various aspects of that international competition, but also look forward. Try and find various ways, which I will explain, in terms of the way in which different aspects of global order will change, not just in terms of the big power relationships that I've mentioned, but also in terms of some of the bigger and more important transnational stories on energy, on science, and in a whole variety of areas where that international competition, I think, will become fierce, but also in some ways very different from what it is today. Looking at this perhaps slightly awkward meeting between President Xi of China and President Trump of the United States, we can see that this is part of a wider and changing relationship between these two countries, which in some ways is not really new to the Trump presidency. In some ways, I would say that the turn towards our present moment, one in which the United States and China look likely to have at least some kind of confrontational relationship in language and in economics, if not necessarily in military terms, perhaps dates from the beginning of the 21st century. Looking back in the year 2025, I would say that perhaps the last time that there was a single global event on which both the US and China were united, that was the entry of China to the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001. And since that time, there has been, I think, undeniably, a divergence between the two, although there are some issues. I mentioned before climate change. There are others where there is some scope for coordination, or has been at least in the recent past. Let me show you how, in some ways, under the Biden administration, which of course has just finished office a few months ago, even then there were ups and downs in the relationship that perhaps could not have been foreseen at the beginning of the term, but it emerged by the end. And by that I mean that these two pictures, in a sense, show the difference in the relationship between the two sides, even in the space of one short 4-year US administration. So some of you who keep an eye on the news will note and remember that back in March 2021, just 2 months into the presidency of Joe Biden, a meeting was held in Anchorage, Alaska, between the Chinese and American sides on trying to coordinate the relationship in various ways after the first Trump administration. And the body language, the language in that room, in some ways symbolizes the gap between the two sides. The delegation of the Americans, led by the new Secretary of State, then Antony Blinken, and on the other side, Minister Wang Yi and others on the Chinese side, essentially wearing masks. This was still the COVID time, of course, and essentially having not a dialogue, but 2 monologues in which each side stated their own grievances and troubles, but without much interaction. Even in the, so in the 2 years that followed, however, there were ups and downs. Again, many of you will remember that one of the most worrying moments of that Biden term in relations, in US-China relations, was the so-called balloon crisis, when the discovery of what China insisted was a weather balloon, and the Americans declared was a spy balloon, was found floating across the Midwest of the United States. And that incident ended only really with the shooting down of that balloon by the US Air Force over the sea off the coast of America. But within a couple of years, slow and steady and behind-the-scenes diplomacy led to a series of changes, particularly by the year 2023. Again, we see a meeting here between then Foreign Minister Qin Gang and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, finally having that kind of long-sought meeting. But beyond that, also the coordination of a meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi at the on the outskirts of the APEC meeting in San Francisco in November of that particular year. And so that was a reminder that in many ways that Biden administration showed what has happened to all US administrations, as well as all Chinese administrations too, which is a constant up and down in that US-China relationship. If there's been a battle for order, to use the term that Chairman Zhang set before us today, then in some ways it consists of many quite small, turbulent encounters and skirmishes and friction, rather than necessarily one huge confrontation. Battles don't have to be large, and they don't always, fortunately, have to be military, but they are part of that wider contour of the relationship between the two sides. Because of that, I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about the bigger picture of where I think that relationship sits between the two sides at the moment. And I'll start by saying something about China's geopolitical role. This is something that I think has been true for a while, but certainly continues to be continuously the case, I think, between the Obama and first Trump administrations, through the Biden administration, and into the present day of the new Trump administration. And again, many of these issues, I hope you'll bring up questions or thoughts or agreements or disagreements in the question and answer session that we'll have in a little while. But overall, here are some thoughts that I think broadly sketch the aims, the overall goals that China seeks in its current global form. First of all, I think there is no doubt that China aims to be, and perhaps is on the way to becoming, the leading power in the Asia-Pacific region. Within the wider ambit of this part of the world, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, China feels, not least because of history and geography, that it should have a dominant role. Beyond that, though, it is clearly both seeking and maintaining significant global influence of a sort that would have been hard to imagine certainly 25 or 30 years ago, when China was not the second biggest economy in the world, and even now is still in formation. There are many discussions and debates around the world, and in Taiwan too, I suspect, about what is the nature of Chinese power in the world. Is it a new empire? Is it the kind of new challenger in terms of the financial system? Is it a country that will use its military power? But one thing that nobody doubts today is that China has that global influence in a way that simply wouldn't have been true just a few years ago. Within that, I am going to put the order of hierarchy, the order of importance, as you see it on the slide there. In other words, I'm going to suggest that if we're talking about the battle for global order, you see I've listened to you, Chairman Jiang, I know what the title you gave me was, and I want to make sure we stick to it during the course of this discussion. I would say the economic battle is really the one that is going to be most dominant, and the one in which China and the United States are both able to compete most evenly. You'll be unsurprised to hear that in a few minutes I'm going to say the word tariff, which has been part of the news for quite some time. But for now, let me just stick to that bigger picture, thinking about China's power. China as a major supplier of foreign direct investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and other means. China as an international financier, China as a country which is trying, not always successfully, to internationalize its currency. These are global economic roles, not just the action of one nation state. And they are at the heart of one of the reasons that that global sense of changing order is so potent at the moment. Chinese economic and financial power absolutely stands at the heart of that. The second factor, and I put it second because it's often put first, particularly by analysts in much of the Western world, and also is of particular concern to many people right here in Taiwan, is the undoubted growth of China's military power. In the space, again, of a relatively short period of time, just 20, 25 years, perhaps even less than that, China has moved from having a relatively inward-looking, relatively limited and technologically middle-level capacity in the military to being the second biggest military in the world, both by spending and in terms of the number of the amount of equipment that it has. And in some areas, such as building naval vessels, China is probably actually number one in the world that way. But also in terms of the high level of technology that it is able to deploy in artificial intelligence, in terms of autonomous weapons, and other aspects of 21st century warfare, which would look very different from those very, very long-standing land-type battles which China went through in the 20th century. Many people, I think everyone here is likely to know, and many people will have read Mao Zedong's classic 1938 essay, 论持久战, on protracted warfare. But these days, I think we are perhaps in an era where some types of warfare are very, very 持久, and others are extremely short and extremely quick, not least as technology enables them. And the third factor I want to bring up, and actually there's a particular poignancy for me in mentioning this, is the idea of soft power. Soft power, again, is a term that many of you will know. The idea that rather than using military force or economic coercion and pressure, instead the power of your example, perhaps put together through your country's culture or its behavior in the wider world, or its ability to cooperate with other countries, creates a favorability for you in the wider world. A Japan or a United States or whatever country it might be that gets Switzerland, Canada, that gets people to do things not because they have to, but because they want to, because they like you and respect you. And I say this is a poignant concept for me because many of you will know the inventor of this concept was the great Harvard political scientist, Professor Joseph Nye, who sadly passed away at the age of 88 last week. But his legacy, including the theory of soft power, has become globally famous and will continue, I think, for many years to come as a key concept. Professor Nye, Joe Nye, was invited many times to China to talk about soft power. The Chinese authorities were very keen, I think, to try and develop it as strongly as possible, spend a lot of money on arts, culture, and other issues, but have found even now that it's a very, very difficult thing to actually produce. And some of the reasons for that, and again, I'd be very interested to hear opinions in this hall later on, and perhaps from Professor Wu, about whether or not you agree that China's soft power is still relatively weak. But overall, for various reasons, possibly the inability to project culture from within China itself because of the quite narrow restrictions on discussions there, and also the over-concentration on using military and economic power instead of letting soft power do the job. All of these mean that for the moment, China still retains a weak level of soft power in contrast with very strong economic power and very strong military power. The term power in this sense, is also one on which I think China's policymakers for many years, or indeed decades, have kept a very close eye, because the use of the term 综合国力, again, comprehensive national power, as a set of comparisons between China, the United States, and other major powers in the world, is something that has been of immense importance, immense significance in China trying to work out where that competition with the United States stands in terms of economic size, in terms of military, and of course also issues such as soft power. And for the moment, in many of those areas, China has been rising, but still finds itself broadly defined as number 2 to the United States. And the question, of course, is whether or not the position of number 1 will change in the next few years. And secondly, perhaps the bigger question of what does it actually mean to be number 1 in this new global order? One thing, of course, that it's possible to talk about is number 1 in terms of trade. And I want to bring this into the discussion because if there is one issue that has been very, very important in the 长期历史时代, the kind of long-range historical period that is the first 4 months of the year 2025, it is almost certainly the question of trade and tariffs, put on the table under the, as part of the policy of the new Trump administration. And whatever you think of tariffs, definitely a new way of doing international geo-economic relations. For the last 80 years, objectively speaking, you could argue that the downgrading of tariffs and barriers has been a key goal in international trade through the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and then later through the WTO, which I mentioned, of course, before, with China's entry in 2001. And now we are in a situation where the US administration has rejected most of the expectations or norms that came from that free trade environment, and instead has chosen to start a different sort of global trading environment, at least as far as the US is concerned, where tariffs sit at the center of the agenda. The picture, the graph here gives you a little bit of a sense of what it was about the US-China relationship that alarmed those in the Trump administration who are in favor of increasing tariffs. The president himself, of course, very much there, but also trade advisors such as Robert Lighthizer, who was US trade representative in the first administration and has written a book called Trade is Not Free, which very, very much pushes back against the idea that you should simply lower tariffs as much as possible. And even though there is a back and forth in terms of the relative size, in terms of the absolute size of imports and exports to and from China and the US, it's clear that over those years, including during the COVID years, 2020, 21, that Chinese exports to the United States, Chinese imports into the United States have far exceeded American exports to China. And while most trade economists would argue that trade deficits are not necessarily a sign of an imbalanced relationship overall, they reflect demand for particular types of goods, for which, of course, there's then fair exchange through currency. Nonetheless, the idea that essentially American manufacturing had been hollowed out through a variety of factors, automation, new technology, but also the rise of manufacturing in China, has now become a very central part of American political thinking, and probably will not change for quite some time to come, judging by its success in allowing Republicans to be elected, who, in contrast with their predecessors from 10 or 15 years ago, are very much against the world of globalized free trade, having previously endorsed it under prior leaders such as Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Sorry. So the new concentration on tariffs as a powerful and in some ways very disruptive economic tool to try and reset global trading relationships and economic relationships puts forward one of the dilemmas that the United States has: how to maintain a tariff regime that includes friends as well as opponents, such as China, as I think they would regard China as being, but at the same time maintain some of those existing relationships that the United States has had in the wider world. And that challenge is expressed in some ways in the continuity as well as the changes that you see in the words of prominent American politicians. So I give you here two quotes, one from the last administration in the US and one from the current one. Antony Blinken, stated that the scale and scope of the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China will test American diplomacy like nothing we've seen before. So he was defining this as the key challenge, certainly for the United States of our time, early on in his term in 2021. And then just a few months ago, in January 2025, I've said that Marco Rubio was the Secretary of State designate because the administration hadn't yet taken office at that stage. But he gave evidence to the Foreign Relations Committee of the US Senate. And in his words, he said, as you see, if we don't change course, we are going to live in the world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. So that is another part of that way in which international security, geoeconomics, supply chains, and tariffs are all coming together in a new American world view, one in which many of the expectations of the old world, in which production should be based on where the cheapest price was, and instead turning issues of economics into security issues, are very much at the center of contemporary thinking. Many of the things that we have seen in the last few weeks and months, I would predict, are going to continue and deepen in many, many ways in the next few years. In other words, although the tariff policy will change, and we've seen already in the first few weeks there's been ups and downs and changes, I think it is very unlikely that we will see in the near future that tariff policy in the US will go back to what it was before, in which tariffs were either very low, single figures, 2 or 3%, or zero. That number we see of a sort of mean of 10% or so, I think is here to stay for quite a while, and that is true for allies of the US, such as the United Kingdom, as much as it is for China or other countries that are felt to be adversaries of the United States. The level, in fact, at the moment, as we speak, of tariffs on China has been an additional 30%, whereas actually some countries that are closer to the US, such as Japan, on some products, such as autos, I think have even higher tariff levels. So tariffs are a tool that I think are here to stay for quite some time. Beyond that, I think also the idea that as much as possible should be produced inside the United States is going to be a very clear forward direction of travel. President Trump, in his inaugural speech, talked about self-sufficiency as an important American goal. And those of you who know Chinese history as well as politics will be aware that for some time, China has also been much more concerned to make sure that economics and security are linked. And they've done this through the proposal of the so-called dual circulation economic policy, in which domestic economics is supposed to be as protected as possible from the outside world, while maintaining an international element that involves exporting to the outside world. So both America and China, two biggest economies in the world, are moving into a position where each wants to make its own domestic economy as self-sufficient and protected as possible, but to make sure that the rest of the world is still dependent on supply chains that link to each of those countries. And that is the set of fast-moving economic changes that we see happening right in front of us at the moment. I've given you American views there, or some of them. Let me give you a few that come from China. And these are both from distinguished scholars working in China today, and these are from published sources, so I don't think there's anything very secret about them. First of all, well-known professor of international relations, Professor Wu Xinbo, who says, talking about Taiwan, of course, and trying to critique the American position, saying that the US believes that because of the so-called Taiwan Relations Act, passed, of course, in 1979 by the US Congress, they have obligations to Taiwan's security and therefore, in quote marks, have the right to develop relations with Taiwan. And then the second point, the US believes that Taiwan is a so-called democratic regime, in quote marks again, and they should support that. So they're saying there are values-based considerations in US relations with Taiwan. And then Professor Wu adds, China's views on the Taiwan issue are poles apart. We believe, meaning we, the People's Republic, that the Taiwan issue is an internal Chinese issue involving China's core interests, such as sovereignty, territorial integrity, and it has to do with national reunification. So although nothing there would be very surprising to most people here, it's interesting to see a senior Chinese thinker lay out what he sees as the difference in viewpoint between the US and China. And below, we have one of the younger rising generation of international relations scholars, Professor Dong Wang, who's at Peking University, Beida, who talks about the possibility for a new engagement consensus. This is a couple of years ago now. And he says it would require both Washington and Beijing to abandon a zero-sum mentality and instead conceive of power as a positive-sum game. As the political scientist Joseph Nye notes, everyone was quoting Joe Nye, it's good to know that he's well remembered, thinking in positive sum terms means not thinking of one's power over others, but thinking in terms of power shared with others to accomplish joint goals. I think there's much to be said for Professor Dong Wang's theory there. But right now, I would suggest we are not moving into a world where that particular view of an engagement consensus between the US and China, or the idea of shared power as opposed to siloed power, is likely to manifest itself anytime very soon. But I offer you those thoughts as part of the mix. Instead, I think what we're likely to see is a whole variety of areas that I would term structural issues in terms of the geoeconomic world that is emerging before us. And I will say a bit more about security and the military in a little bit, but I want to start with the economic side first. First of all, I think that in the last 5 or 6 years, ever since the COVID pandemic, the whole world, whether it's China, United States, Taiwan, Europe, Africa, has become aware of how important and how vulnerable supply chains for global trade actually are. For a long time, the questions of supply chains and logistics were not amongst the most interesting of the issues that international trade theorists or economists tended to have in mind. But today, it is one of the hottest subjects that there is, not least as politicians, not least President Trump, speak very strongly in public about wanting to reduce or shorten supply chains around the world as much as possible. And of course, much of the debate for the last 5 to 6 years has been about whether or not the United States and China will decouple from each other. The idea being that in a kind of extreme scenario, everything that is sold and imported into the United States will be completely free of any components made or produced in or through China. And on the Chinese side, presumably everything that could be excluded from the United States and maybe the Western world would also be so as well. In the case of the former, it's more likely to be goods. In the case of the second, it's more likely to be services. And we see plenty of examples of that on the American decoupling side. Companies like Apple are talking about moving final assembly of their smartphone products, iPhones, to India, even though the components put together in them are still coming from China. And while it's perhaps sometimes harder to see the decoupling on the other side, you might note that big American software firms like Microsoft are certainly, it's being suggested that their products, Windows and other Microsoft international products, may steadily be removed from Chinese laptops and computers as China seeks to indigenize its software, even while it tries to make it globally compatible. So we can see it in various forms. And yet, it's not clear how far that's going to go. Within the last few days, last week in fact, when the latest round of tariff negotiations between China and the United States had ended, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said explicitly about the aims of the talks that it was never, I think his phrase was, it was never about a general decoupling. So he used the D word, decoupling, and made it clear, at least in the view of the current US Treasury Secretary, that complete separation is not the goal for now. Now, whether or not that means you have a clue, a sense of destination in terms of current US-China policy, not entirely clear, but it's important to be aware that a senior official has actually made that comment. One of the reasons I think that decoupling of a complete variety is quite unlikely is that much of what decoupling involves these days is not really about simply particular goods or products, but about the whole ecology that surrounds it. And again, Taiwan, which of course has become famous for the manufacture of semiconductor chips, amongst other things, is one of the places that sits in the middle of such an ecology, even though many people have tried to reproduce those chips elsewhere in the world, including actually the companies which have been most involved with making them here, setting up fabs elsewhere in the world. Nonetheless, the Taiwan productive environment, the combination of people, the place, the conditions, the long history of building up that particular type of ecology for chip production can't simply be instantly reproduced somewhere else. And that sense of the talent pool, particularly in the IP, the intellectual property, which sit at the heart of the most economically rich and productive parts of the global economy, is a difficult barrier to overcome. In other words, simply thinking that the US or China or anyone else can quickly reproduce that very, very complex series of relationships between labor, capital, and production, I think is going to be a hard obstacle to overcome. The third point here, and what I want to say a bit more about, is the question of energy. The issue is that these days, unlike in the 1970s and 80s, there is no real fear of a lack of energy availability. People don't think oil is going to run out or fossil fuels will run out. Fracking and shale production and other means have made that clear. But the problem that comes with fossil fuel energy technology of climate change is clearly still very, very much feared and experienced by much of the world. And therefore, the question of who gets to operationalize and embed the green energy economy is probably one of the single most important questions of the rest of this decade and into the 2030s as well. And beyond that, linked to all these, the question of international and global capital. Who is able to raise capital? Who is able to move it around the world to invest it? And what will it be invested in and how? These questions used to be, in some sense, quite non-political ones, at least non-party political. But now the politics of the US-China relationship have meant that even the choice of where and how to invest have become highly politicized as well. So let me spend a few minutes diving down into a few specific cases. I'd love to take even more, but of course we want to stick to a reasonable amount of time so that we can have comments from Professor Wu and wider discussion with everyone here, I would hope. The first is the idea of green energy as a moral narrative. What do I mean by that term? Well, first of all, let me show you just with these graphs what we're talking about in terms of China's engagement with energy production and its move towards green, post-fossil fuel, clean energy production. First of all, you have on the left-hand side there a graph of how between 1992 and 2022, so that's basically about 30 years, China has continuously increased its national supply of electricity generation with hydro, renewables and nuclear energy, all of which of course are non-fossil fuel. And they're pretty impressive numbers overall. At the same time, you also have to note that if you look at the comparison of the emission of fossil fuels between China and the United States, and of course that green line is the rest of the world as well, China is still making up a pretty hefty chunk of overall fossil fuel emissions that are continuing to fuel climate change. So China is both one of the four actors, along with India, EU, and the United States, that is producing huge amounts of carbon that is fueling climate change, but also, to be fair, is also making huge strides in terms of that green energy capacity. And I think that one of the ways in which China will take advantage of the decision by the Trump administration to push back towards more sale and use of fossil fuels is that China will portray itself as being the global leader in terms of green energy. Now, as I say, I'm showing you this graph to point out that this isn't necessarily literally true in the case of China, because there's both lots of capacity on green energy, but also lots of production of carbon. But the point about narratives is that they're a way of telling a story. They're not necessarily a granular, detailed way of giving all the details of what's going on. And I think China portraying itself as the provider of the next great global public good. In other words, the idea that green energy is going to be the answer to rising economies in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, rather than using fossil fuels, because those countries, of course, are the ones most vulnerable to climate change in the first place. In Southeast Asia, for instance, the idea of coastal erosion or indeed of worsening weather, where there are already typhoons, is something that makes the need to move to a more climate-friendly form of energy much more urgent than might be the case in inland areas of North America, where the effects are not as easily felt. And so I would predict that that moral narrative, the battle over the moral narrative of who is the clean energy provider to the world, is going to become a much bigger part of the global discourse in the next 10 years and beyond. Another area in which I think that there is going to be many changes in terms of global order is the question of where Russia fits. I haven't mentioned Russia yet, but it is one of the things that is clearly going to be a wild card, or at the very least a kind of unpredictable factor in an increasingly unpredictable new global order. And many of you may have heard a term that was being used quite a bit just 2 or 3 months ago, in about February, March of this year, when it wasn't clear how the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war that followed that was going to be resolved. And one particularly bold new proposal that came from inside the new administration was the idea of what some people called the reverse Nixon or reverse Kissinger move, depending which one you prefer to put forward. So just a reminder, down at the bottom you have the picture there of 50 years, actually more than that, 53 years ago, of then US President Richard Nixon visiting China, shaking hands with Chairman Mao, and breaching, or healing a breach between the two countries that had lasted really since 1949, when the Civil War ended, the Communist Party won on the mainland, and of course the Kuomintang came here and re-established the ROC on Taiwan, or kept it in continuity if you prefer. So that moment, of course, was significant because it was the beginning of a process where, at least for a couple of generations, both the United States was in a position to speak both to the PRC and to the Soviet Union, and essentially maneuvered so that the Soviets were alienated from the Chinese and China was closer to the United States. Not what the ideology would have suggested, but of course something that was geopolitically very useful to an America which was trying to end the Vietnam War and get out of a very difficult situation in Asia. So people ask, could the same thing be happening now? Could Trump's friendliness towards Vladimir Putin actually be a sign that America can peel Putin away from Xi Jinping, that the two of them will in some ways be separated, and instead the US may be able to bring Russia to the side so that it can concentrate on pushing back against China? My opinion is that I don't think that this is likely to work out. And some of the evidence for that really came last week, where many of you will have seen that in Moscow, indeed, in Red Square, Xi and Putin stood together very, very publicly as a clear sign that whatever maneuvers might be happening, or even when there are disagreements between the two of them, nonetheless, both still regard Washington as either a capital city with which they have significant and severe differences, or at worst, actually, an adversary. Putin at the moment has more motivation to at least try and fit in with some American lead and desires around the Ukraine war. Beijing doesn't currently have too much motivation, but of course on the question of tariffs has been willing to negotiate. But those negotiations are very different from the idea of a fundamental global reset in which America and Russia push back against China. That, I think, is an extremely unlikely outcome, although we've had a lot of quite unlikely outcomes in the recent past, it must be said. And beyond that, I think that we are likely to see continued back and forth on tariffs. So I think for a while, the 30% tariffs that we see on China are likely to stay where they are. This was a statement that the White House made just over 3 months ago. It feels like a very long time ago. But here, the argument is that because China's intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, other unreasonable behavior, whatever that might be, President Trump acted to impose tariffs, using leverage to reach a historic bilateral economic agreement. And I would say that having got the current agreement, that's likely to stick there for quite some time. I don't think that that tariff level will change all that much up or down in the near future. Instead, attention may well turn to where we are now. And this is one of the most unknowable issues, I think, in the present moment. But again, your views would be very, very welcome in the discussion. There are some indications that things have changed. At one point, there was an interest about the fact the State Department no longer has placed the words One China policy on its website, or that may have at least been the example of some sort of bureaucratic clearing up going on, or it may be the case that something else more fundamental is happening, but there's no official statement about that. I think it's fair to say that people who have put forward any public statements at all from DOD, the Pentagon, and State Department still advocate a highly defensive posture for Taiwan. The idea that Taiwan defending itself is an American interest does not seem to have changed at the moment. There's also quite a lot of emphasis by the new administration on quite traditional allied efforts in Asia. The AUKUS program, Australia, UK, United States on nuclear-powered submarines, put in under Biden, that's still ongoing, at least for the moment. And many will have seen the Secretary of Defense of the United States in Tokyo and Manila in recent months, making very strong statements which chime in with the traditional belief of US administrations that they have a role in defending Asia. That, though, comes with the combination, if the position on defense regarding Taiwan is still quite traditional, carrying over from what we had before, on trade, things might have changed. I think in this room you will be aware that Taiwan is one of America's trading partners that has also had quite a harsh new tariff regime put upon it, and the question of whether or not that can be negotiated down, I think, is still very active in certain ways. In the last couple of minutes, let me look at a couple of areas that perhaps have received less attention. Trade and Taiwan continue to be big issues in US-China relations, and Russia, of course, is going to be one that will be very big in Europe for a long time to come. But let me give a couple of other longer range areas, perhaps slightly more unexpected, where there will be a competition, maybe even a battle of sorts, in years to come. And I think one of them is about science. Whether or not the global south, the Western world, and China will continue to collaborate and cooperate on science research and the commercialization of science, or whether we will get separate science silos. In other words, the idea that China's science and Western science will go into increasingly separate categories. So I give you here just a few of the examples, I could give more, of ways in which global south nations have been putting together collaborations with Chinese science in various ways. On the left-hand side, you have the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. We've got an MOU with the Chinese Space Administration from 2022. Up the top, you have Brazil-China science collaboration going on. And below, you have Singapore, where again, collaboration with both American and Western science and Chinese science has been going on for a while, along with the commercialization of those particular elements. I give you those three particular countries, UAE, Brazil, and Singapore, because they seem to me to be places at a greater or lesser level that could, in the next 5, 10, 20 years, become serious science hubs. Not today, not tomorrow morning, not even next year, but over the next 10 to 20 years, they have sufficient income, perhaps more the UAE and Singapore, but Brazil to some extent, and also the interest in developing their science and technology bases, and they have an interest in drawing on what they can from the West and from China. So the question is whether that will actually be possible to draw on both sides or not, even if those two silos separate. And I think so fast the news is moving that, in fact, yesterday's headlines suggest one clue in that direction. You'll have seen that as President Trump left the Gulf, he had been both in UAE and in Saudi Arabia and made a very, very clear statement, along with some of the immediate trade deals that have been done, that in terms of AI, data centers, and actually what is really continuing science and research collaboration, he wants the United States to be working very closely with those two countries, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. My instinct is that that will mean that perhaps in the short term, not even the long term, the US pushing those countries not to continue collaboration with China might be on the agenda. And so the space program you see here might become part of that shift. Let me finish off by just reflecting for one moment, and perhaps leading over to Professor Wu with his reflections about what this might mean in terms of looking forward perhaps even 20 years, to how the US-China competition and the global struggle for order might manifest themselves in the next 2 decades or so. I think that these are things that we don't necessarily have to see, but I think are likely to emerge. I think we are moving into an era of divergence on energy policy. We talked a bit about that, green versus fossil fuel, and both will be needed, but the question of who goes with whom and how, that will become important. Second one is the divergence on science and research environments. I mentioned that last, but I do think it's perhaps one of the most important and long-lasting elements of the competition. The third is whether or not actually China's thinking about domestic order, ideas of what I call welfarist authoritarianism. In other words, the idea that you want to try and create more kind of social welfare in the society, but also have much more political control over civil society, might become more popular globally as the world seems, at least in some cases, to be moving against the more liberal type of democracy we saw for more than half a century in much of the world, certainly post-Cold War. And finally, most intriguingly, the possible division of the world into hemispheres of influence, whether or not there will be a Western hemisphere in which the United States will remain the key power, and an Eastern one in which perhaps China will rise to that role. Right now, as I say, it seems to me that the United States still has enough interest in the status quo in Asia that that won't happen immediately. But that having been said, this is about not a 1 year, but a 20-year speculation. And during that time, the one thing I think we can say for sure is that the world order of 20 years from now will not be exactly the same as it is today in 2025. So our job, and I hope now actually as part of the discussion, is to continue the thoughts and speculation about how we get from 2025 to 2045 and what the journey along the way might actually be. Chairman Zhang, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mitter, for your inspiring speech. Professor Mitter, you can take a short break now. Okay. Okay, next, we would like to invite Academician Wu to the stage to share his comment. Welcome.
Chairman Zhang, Professor Mitter, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to be invited to dialogue with Professor Mitter on this very important subject, namely the relationship between the United States and the PRC and its implications on global order. And I think Professor Mitter has given a very detailed account about the interaction between these two powers in different sectors, trade, investment, energy, and so on and so forth. Also, he brings about the issue about reverse Nixon and the Taiwan issue, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes will be to provide a international relations account of the deep cause of the conflict between these two countries, concentrated on the two leaders, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, and try to envision what will happen in the future based on these two types of leaderships. So the background of confrontation, obviously, is power transition. The resurgence of China is a game changer. So I think the most important thing that has happened in the 20th century that has deep impact on what we are experiencing nowadays is the successful economic reform of the PRC. That changed everything. I have to bring about this international theorist who made his fame in the 1950s and 1960s. He really was very much ahead of his time because he said international system is stable when there is a hegemon. It will become unstable when a rising power is challenging the hegemon. That is, when there is power transition between the hegemon and its challenger. And Graham Allison at Harvard cites historical cases to demonstrate the power transition theory. So the theory was originally developed by Organsky, but then Allison gave very vivid historical cases to demonstrate how that power transition theory can be demonstrated in real history, and it coins the concept of Thucydides' trap, which is based on the historical case of the Peloponnesian War, fought between Athens and Sparta, when Athens rose to challenge the hegemon Sparta. So Sparta was the original hegemon, and Athens rose to challenge it, and that created the so-called Thucydides trap, where you have the hegemon who is being challenged by a rising power, then it's likely that you are going to have a war. So the same as what Organsky said. And this Graham Allison, and the statue is Thucydides. And obviously, when Allison talks about Thucydides, he has in his mind the conflict between the United States, the incumbent hegemon, and the rising power, namely the PRC. So he wrote a book destined for war. Are the United States and the PRC doomed? Namely, they fall into the Thucydides trap, and they are destined for a war. So that's the big question. Now, let's zoom in to take a look at the United States and China and bring in the respective leaders and also the years. In 2012 to 2013, Xi Jinping became the Chinese Communist Party's General Secretary. He became the General Secretary at the 18th Party Congress in 2012. And then he became the President of the People's Republic of China in 2013. In 2014, China's GDP on PPP terms, namely purchasing power parity, surpassed the United States in 2014. So that's 1 year after Xi Jinping became the president of the PRC. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. Power transition theory will predict that there will be upheavals in the US-PRC relations under Xi and Trump, right? Because you take a look at this map, you will see that China surpassing the United States in the year 2014. And 2 years before that happened, Xi Jinping became the leader of China. 2 years after that happened, Donald Trump became the leader of the United States. And power transition theory said that when you have the incumbent hegemon challenged by the rising power, then there will be conflict. And the two may even end up in a war. So if you follow power transition theory, if you follow Thucydides' trap, you will say that it is exactly right, because we have already witnessed what the theory predicts. So Trump says that he will want to make America great again, so he will want to reassert US dominance. And Xi Jinping said that he wants to have great resurgence of the Chinese nation, 中华民族伟大复兴, to revive great China in history. with such unreconcilable aspirations, too abound to clash when their national powers near. That the two great powers will see each other as its arch rival is in no doubt. What we are not sure of is whether the rivalry will lead inevitably to war or can be contained to sub-war level conflict. And I think this is to be determined by the stage of development of the two countries and their particular leaders. So the two will clash. There will be serious confrontations. We know that from grand theoretical international relations and history studies. But then would that lead to war? We will have to take a look at the very stage in which the two countries find themselves, as well as that stage, the kind of leadership that development stage creates. So where's China? Why did it create Xi Jinping? Here I'm going to use a three-dimensional framework to locate China's position for you. The first one is concentration of political power. When we take a look at a communist regime, we will use the three dimensions. They are derived from the study of comparative communism. The first one is how concentrated is political power in this particular regime. The second one is the expansion of the party state. How deeply penetrated is the state by the party state? And the third one is the degree of institutionalization. Do we have very institutionalized politics in China? A composite index of the above three determines the position of the regime along a totalitarian spectrum. We can draw a totalitarian spectrum. We can put various different regimes with the same regime in different historical stage on that spectrum, and we can compare those regimes. So we can put all communist regimes, historical or contemporary, on that spectrum and determine their positions. So what I'm characterizing today's Xi Jinping's rule in China is that it is a re-Maoization, 再毛化. Let's first take a look at the concentration of political power. Xi Jinping raised his own statue to the level of Mao and Deng, probably surpassing Deng. If we take a look at the third resolution on party history, you will see that he has already risen his position on the history to the level of Mao Zedong. He grabbed the prime minister's power, both from Li Keqiang and Li Qiang, especially the economic power. The party is now taking a lot of state functions. He purged a lot of cadres, so on and so forth. So he is very successful in concentrating political power in his hands. And he is only second to Mao Zedong in that regard. So, re-Maoization. About the expansion of the party state, this building of new whole country system, 举国体制. Private championship enterprises brought under party control. Jack Ma, Ma Yun. He just like rehabilitated, right? Because he was out of public scene for a long time. And so those bosses of very important private enterprises in China, they are under direct party control. Cultural conservatism. Xi Jinping will remove very popular TV series from the channels if he thinks that this is decadent. I mean, this kind of things I don't want the Chinese young generation to see that. He can do that. Suppression of Western influence. I have a student right now teaching in Shanghai. And she informs me that every teacher in the city have received instructions from the party, from the school. Of course, you have very strong party cells in the school, basically telling them that you should discourage students from celebrating Western holidays. which means like Christmas. So that's the kind of cultural atmosphere that you have today in China. And this is under Xi Jinping. The third one is deinstitutionalization, softening of age limit. We all know that under Hu Jintao, if you are at a specific level of the Chinese hierarchy, then there's a specific point of retirement for you, which is compulsory. And it is to the month, you know. So if you are 65, and you are at a certain level, and you are required to retire, then you retire. But then, that would obviously reduce the control of the bureaucrats by the top leader. So Xi Jinping softened the age limit. The political succession is in doubt, starting from him. He is now serving the third term, right? And I think there's every possibility he's going to seek his fourth term. And by doing so, he is setting the example for the whole officialdom that the political succession is really in doubt. It really depends on the will of the top political leader to decide whether you can stay in your position. And the causes for the three phenomena. The first one is the concentration of political power. The second one is the expansion of the party state. And the third one is deinstitutionalization. Why do we have all these things? I think the first reason is the unique political socialization experience of the Xi generation. It's an activism to the Maoist era. Xi himself and his father, they were purged under Mao Zedong. But somehow he learned from the great chairman. And that has been really down into his mind. And he always said that we should never forget our original ideals, 不忘初心. So he would always want to bring those socialist ideas back. So that is a very unique feature of the Xi and his generation. The second one, I think, probably is more important. Namely, this is a real guard action taken by the party hardliners who are weary of the party state movement towards routinization. And here I'm using a Bavarian term, namely toward a typical authoritarian regime or even toward pluralism and liberalism under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. Actually, a lot of Western scholars, Western countries, policymakers, they are putting a lot of hope on China becoming a normal country, experiencing modernization, affluence in the economy, educated young people, experiences of overseas study, and so on and so forth. All these things are supposed to bring about a modernized China, which means probably the Chinese Communist Party is going to lose the control. So I'm using this diagram to show to you that this is a line that divide the changes within the party state. And here I'm talking about the party state, communism. And this is an area where you have non-communist authoritarianism. So this is a very important. If you cross from this to that, then you are probably in today's Russia under Vladimir Putin. But then if you are shifting within this range, then you are a party state, the Communist Party state, and if you have normalized politics, then you are in post-totalitarianism. But if you are in the totalitarian mode of politics, then it would be very much like Mao Zedong. Deng Xiaoping led the country into normalized politics. And he was followed by Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao. And here we have post-totalitarianism and developmentalism, very much like East Asian countries. But then Xi Jinping is bringing the country back to the direction of Mao Zedong. So re-Maoization under Xi. And so we have two possible directions. We may have a Chinese leader who is more like Deng, Jiang, and Hu in the future, or we will have a person like Xi Jinping, a neo-Maoist. Where is the United States? Trump has three faces. The first one, of course, is the hegemon suppressed challenger that reflects the US and China are near power transition and Cold War 2.0 has been started. So this is the first phase. And this phase is shared by both the Republicans and the Democrats, by both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But the second phase is different. It has a neo-mercantilist phase that reflects the economic decline of American manufacturing and the need for state activism. So like the tariff that Donald Trump is putting on all America's trading partners. The third one is right-wing populism that reflects social unrest rooted in increasing income disparity and mobilization of the bottom social strata against foreigners and foreign countries. So there you have uniquely Trumpian statement and policy, like we would like to take Canada as our 51st state. We would like to take the Panama Canal. We would like to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, and so on and so forth. The three mutually unreducible developments converge to produce Trumpism. So the world is led into Cold War 2.0, and this is because of this one, power transition, but in a mercantilist and populist way. So this is the characterization out of what we have under the influence of Donald Trump. And for Trump, there are three legs, right? But nowadays, it seems that he is not that much interested in maintaining American hegemony, but more interested than the, in the neo-mercantilism aspiration. So Trump said, China is an economic enemy because they have taken tremendous advantage of us like nobody in history. But allies have taken tremendous advantage of the US. They are in many ways worse than the enemy. So alliance is considered to be detrimental to US interests. And in international relations, we know that when you are facing a threat, you can respond by either taking the strategy of internal balancing, that is making yourself strong, building up your military, and so on and so forth, or external balancing. External balancing meaning you will build an alliance system against a common enemy. But for Trump, external balancing, alliance, is detrimental to US interest. This is the first American president who has ever made such statement. So he would like to make America great again. I'm approaching to the end very quickly. Xi Jinping is different from all the CCP general secretaries in the reform area. Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, unlike none of them. So Xi is the neo-Maoist versus Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, the reformers. Trump is different from all the American presidents since 1920s. So Trump is the neo-mercantilist versus a century of liberal hegemonist American president. Liberal, but then, of course, hegemony. It's likely that the combination of neo-Maoist and neo-mercantilist is most prone to conflict. That does not bode well for the Trump-Xi cohabitation. So let's take a look at this one. Leaders matters. So in the United States, you can have either a liberal hegemonist president or a neo-mercantilist president. In China, you can have either a reformer secretary general or neo-Maoist. At the very beginning, you have this conflict tendency relatively low, namely you have Hu Jintao, who is a reformer, and Obama, a liberal hegemonist from 2009 to 2012. But then that moved to Xi Jinping, a neo-Maoist. He was cohabiting with a liberal hegemonist. So the conflict tendency is median between United States and the PRC, Xi and Obama from 2012 to 2017. And then we move to a neo-Maoist Xi Jinping, a neo-mercantilist Trump from 2017 to 2021, and again from 2021 onward. And here we have the conflict tendency the highest. As liberalism is overwhelmed by mercantilism and populism in the US, as reviewing the red waves mobilized by Trump, the chances that we are going to have a future liberal hegemonist president like Obama are slim. So finally, Taiwan. 4 years ago, on the cover of The Economist, the most dangerous place on earth is Taiwan. The Economist insists that Taiwan is a dangerous place. It says that even though our prediction seems not correct, because the next year, 2022, February 24th, Putin ordered the Russian troops into Ukraine, and then 2023, October 7th, there was this massacre of Israelis, and then Israel bombed the Gaza Strip back to Stone Age, from north to south, south to north, north to south, south to north. Endless. But then, this is the most recent cover of The Economist that says that the Taiwan test is closer than you think. So it insists that Taiwan is in a very dangerous place. Finally, we all know that when you have highly charged electric areas, there may be a passage that can convey the electric current to go through it, while at the same time burn it. So if you have very high tendencies of conflict between the United States and the PRC, then Taiwan right in the middle is really not in a good position. So Taiwan is right at the spot where the pressure generated by hegemonic rivalry may be unleashed. So on that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wu and Professor Mitter, for your wonderful presentations, and very, very illuminating. Now we are entering the second period of our event, that is the dialogue between the two speakers. But before we open the floor to our audience to ask questions, but first of all, I would like to ask you to Scarlett a couple of questions according to what you presented just now. Let me begin with the problem about the nature of the two regions and the possible development of the relation between the two regions. Because in your presentation, you too described the United States and China in different ways. And it reminded me the article that Professor Mitter just published in Foreign Affairs a few days ago. The title is the Once and the Future China. And in that very interesting article, you mentioned that maybe in 20 years to come, the model of China and the model of the United States will stand for two different kinds of models for the rest of the world. And you use the two different terms to describe the nature of the two countries. For the United States, you try to say that with the coming to power of Donald Trump, it is becoming more and more illiberal. So maybe the government and the society of the United States will become a hybrid illiberal democracy. And on the other hand, for the China's part, the term you used in your presentation is welfarist authoritarianism. That is, the government try to take care of the people in many different welfarist measures, but will keep a very strong control politically and surveillance and something like that. And you put the contrast in order to ask the question, which one will attract the following of the rest of the world? In addition to the two countries, we have so many other countries. We have Russia, we have India, we have Brazil, we have all the global south. And then you seem to indicate that for the United States, because illiberal democracy, it will be losing its attraction to all the rest countries, especially among the West. So maybe the United States will not be able to maintain its soft power, to use Joseph Nye's term, in the coming decades. And for the Chinese part, although the so-called welfarist authoritarianism is very attractive and popular in some areas, especially in global south, but again, it also has its own limitations. So what I got from your article and your presentation is that neither of the two regimes will remain as attractive as before, because they have their own shortcomings and weaknesses. And will it be possible that in the years to come, the global order will enter into a new era of multipolar system, not one superpower, not two superpower or hegemon, but nobody follow the others. That is, we will have the United States and China competing with each other, but maybe no one can defeat the other one decisively. And all the other countries will just take advantage of the confrontation and try to find a place of their own. I don't know what will you think about the future to come. And again, the same question will be for Professor Wu, because what you try to say is that the comparison is between a so-called, for China, the neo-Maoist leader, and for America, we have a neo-mercantilist and a populist leader. Of course, we cannot predict what kind of leader in the United States will be after Donald Trump. But the possibility is pretty high that the liberal ideology of a Democrat will not be able to come back very soon. So suppose that the so-called right-wing populism and the neo-mercantilist tendency will remain for a while, then again, which one will be more attractive to the rest of the world? Or, as I said, as I asked, are we entering into a new age with no models for the rest of the world to follow? A question for two.
Chairman Jiang, thank you for a really... Is that, yep, yes, good. So again, many thanks to Chairman Jiang for a wonderful question, and to Professor Wu for an extremely stimulating, although at times quite alarming commentary, I would say. We must talk more about neo-Maoization, which is a really interesting term. Let me respond to your point, though, because I think that multipolarity, I think, is certainly emerging. But let me say something a little bit more about ideology and values, because that, I think, enables me to speak to one of the comments on one of your slides, Professor Wu, when you said, right at the end, I think, that you thought that it's unlikely that there will be another, I think, liberal hegemonist president of the United States anytime soon. And that may well be true. We just don't know. But let's assume that it is true for some time to come, maybe 4 years, 8 years, 12 years. You know, for all of us, that's a long time. I would then want to analyze one of the parts, just one part of your question, Chairman Jiang, because you said that maybe these two regimes, these two ways of thinking about governance, the new neo-mercantilist Trump type of thinking, and Xi Jinping's new, perhaps more, neo-Maoist China, if we want to use Professor Wu's interesting term, will be less attractive to the rest of the world. But I think what we have to think about in the next few years is supposing actually they are quite attractive to the rest of the world, because most of the world is no longer interested in being liberal. In other words, supposing the effects of this are that some of the trends we see in Europe, where in France, in Germany, possibly in Romania tomorrow, where there's a general election, there is a move towards elected governments, but ones that have a more, I'm going to use a more specific word, I'm amongst distinguished political scientists. So rather than saying authoritarian, I'm going to say anti-pluralist and anti-liberal. I think that's probably the most accurate way to describe them. And in that context, the new type of government in the United States might prove a model for that sort of government. There are going to perhaps be fewer examples of governments that are more conventionally liberal. I'm not going to say liberal hegemonic, because I think they're no longer hegemons. You know, Canada, Australia have elected more conventionally liberal governments. The UK has one at the moment. But actually the number of places around the world in the global south which have electoral democracies, but which are also moving in a more polarized direction. In South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana has just elected actually a more populist government of that sort. It's still one of Africa's most notable democracies, but the kind of democracy they've elected, or the kind of government they've elected, is much more in the direction of this global trend. And then also in Southeast Asia, where again, electoral democracies are operating in many countries, but the kind of candidates elected tend to be more in that direction. So if that's the case, then maybe the choice is more going to be between two types of anti-liberalism. And I have actually, not to want to keep advertising, but a piece coming out actually in a volume this summer edited by a very interesting historian who works on policy, Hal Brands, who many people here will know. It's on US-China relations. The piece I've written is about what I call competitive anti-liberalism. And that seems to me actually a very plausible direction of travel for what's happening with the US and China in the world. But let me just add one quick thought to move on to Professor Wu. There will be contradictions even there. And if we're talking about neo-Maoism, we all know that Mao was very keen on the idea of the Maodun, the contradiction as a theoretical Marxist way of understanding society. Think about Hungary. Hungary is a country which has moved towards much more populist form of national conservative government. And I think that the government, the Vice President of the United States, Mr. Vance, has actually said that he thinks Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is a good example of how that new type of government should run. But at the same time, if you look at the country that, or the countries that are most popular in economic terms in collaboration with Hungary, China is top of the list. There is a branch of Fudan University in Budapest. Lots of investment is coming from China into Hungary for building BYD, you know, the car factories. So whether the language is pro the new type of US, but the economic message as well as some of the language is pro-China, that's going to be very interesting, Maodun, for countries like Hungary, which consider themselves to be at the forefront of the explicitly new, what they would say is anti-liberal consensus.
Thank you. Professor Wu?
I fully agree with Professor Mitter that it is possible that with Trump and the victory, electoral victory of a lot of populist parties in European countries and other countries in the world, a new example may be on the rise. That is illiberal democracy. That is, you can get political power through elections. There are regular elections for sure, but then there are a lot of restrictions on your liberties. And there's no emphasis on human rights and so on and so forth. As long as you can hold majority in the parliament or you are elected president, you can pretty much do whatever you want. I mean, this is what Trump is now doing. So it is indeed a worrying sign. And I agree with Professor Mitter that if this becomes a universal situation, then the ideological appeal of Trumpism may be still there because he is going to bring about a group of such kind of regimes in not only European countries, but in countries across the world. So this is number one. The second short answer is that we are talking about basically the soft power, right? Whether the country can appeal other countries through their examples. But hard power, economic power, military power, and so on and so forth still matter. So I remember vividly that President Trump said that, I don't need to talk with them. They need to talk with us, right? So he is exercising crude American economic power to force all the countries in the world to kowtow to him in Washington, D.C. And that's exactly the case. I mean, we are doing that, right? So I think that if you have United States and China being the dominant hard power countries in the world, even though they may have less soft power, they can still command a lot of followings and constitute their own blocks and confront each other. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My second question is about the Taiwan issue. As you asked at the last slide on your presentation, Professor Wu, that Taiwan seems to be the spot point for the confrontation between the U.S. and China. But now my question is something that maybe many audience in the hall will be interested in. That is the statement made by President Donald Trump a few days ago, saying that China's open its market to the states will be good for unification and peace, and quote unquote. That statement almost immediately stimulates a huge amount of speculation and discussion in Taiwan. Some people think that, well, now we can see this is Donald Trump's unintentional revelation of his mind. That is, he may want to make a deal with Chairman Xi Jinping, and Taiwan will be sorted out in some way. But some other guys, especially a person closer to the government, will try to persuade the people that it is not the case. That is just a mischoice of the terminology. What Trump wants to say is just a unity of trade instead of unification of the two sides. Okay, whatever that is, I don't know, and we cannot read the mind of Donald Trump. But I think many people are curious about what a leader like Donald Trump, neo-mercantilist, will do about Taiwan with that kind of trading mentality in his mind. Will it be possible in some way that Donald Trump will use Taiwan as a chess piece to make a deal with mainland China? What do you think? Also.
Well, perhaps if we want to regard this comment about unification in theoretical terms, we could call it a Maoyi Maodun. I don't know. Perhaps that would be the element there. I think in terms of the question of where the US is thinking about Taiwan, one thing that is at the moment clear is that President Trump himself seems to actually be keeping his cards very, very hidden. In other words, I don't think we actually yet know what the direction of travel is supposed to be. And if you look at different people within the US administration, different groups, there are often some really quite strongly differing views about what the endpoint should be on the Taiwan question. The first thing to say, and I'm going to be very careful saying this being here in Taipei, which is a city I've been coming to for more than 30 years and think it's a wonderful place, But I don't think the Taiwan question right now is at the top of the list of American priorities anyway. I think they're thinking a lot about the Middle East. I think they're trying to think about how to deal with Russia, Ukraine, and getting quite frustrated. And actually, domestic politics is really shaping a great deal of what's happening in America. So yes, China matters, and China and Taiwan matter too in the wider sense. But I think in some ways, this brief quarrel over tariffs, which has now ended after really just a few weeks with this 30% tariff, is a sign that the administration, I think, don't want to make a big fuss about this at the moment. And I give you again that comment I mentioned from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who said the aim was never general decoupling. So, you know, that may not be a statement for the whole administration, but it's clearly there. Now, there are some figures who are influential in the administration. So Steve Bannon, a well-known figure who is not in the administration, but it's felt that people listen to him. He has been saying for a long time that he thinks that essentially, you know, China and America are destined for war. He does not use Professor Allison's book, I think, but that phrasing, you know, is something he would recognize. And then there's the question of many of the people involved with technology in the US, you know, very powerful people who often have quite a lot of interests in China and actually want to know not just about market, but about intellectual property. I mentioned briefly AI. A lot of those people are really looking closely at what's happening in China on AI and thinking, well, you know, that's a place that we want to find out more about. And that involves probably more encounters, not less in that sense. To keep it brief, I think that for the moment, by which I mean, you know, certainly months to come, maybe more than that, actually there will not be an official change of any sort in US thinking about, official thinking about Taiwan. I think the idea that there is going to be a strong American presence in the Asia-Pacific, naval and military and diplomatic, is very much the position of most of the people involved with the Pentagon and the State Department. If that changes, it might change quite quickly if basically the president decides it's going to change. But so far, I think the comment about unification, you know, I don't know what the motivation was, but my sense is it doesn't match any other signs of any real shift in US policy on Taiwan for the moment. But that's how it seems to me, anyway.
Again, I agree fully with Professor Mitter's comments. I don't think there is any grand strategic shift on Taiwan. So what was on Trump's mind, I don't know. He dozed off, right, on several occasions when he visiting, so who knows. But I think the most important thing is to understand Trump. Trump is an American president who would like everything to be put on dollar terms. So you want to convince him that something the United States would have to do, then you have to make him believe that doing so would make America benefit from that endeavor. So I think Taiwan is a terribly important asset for it to be easily traded off. But on the other hand, Taiwan probably is not that important for the United States to defend at whatever cost. So everything comes with a price tag. And for Trump, never say never, right? This is the remark he gave to the Prime Minister from Canada. So I think if Taiwan wants to be safe, if we want to have American protection when push comes to shove, we have to prove on dollar terms why the United States should do that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to professors. Now, I would like to open the floor to take questions. Anyone who want to ask any question to our two speakers, please just raise your hand and identify yourself and ask your questions. Okay? Yes, please.
Thank you, both speakers. I'm Teresa from NCCU Diplomacy. So throughout the speeches, we have heard about like self-sufficiency and decoupling, as well as the Cold War 2.0. So throughout my studying, I have been I have been through a lot of great debates about whether U.S. and China has been enter into a new Cold War. And yeah, this is my question, basically. So I am begging two speakers both to answer these questions for me, because in the speeches individually, I can sense that kind of different views from you. Like Mr. Mitter has talked about like decoupling is not happening because now U.S. and China has been a new tariff negotiation. So we can see from that decoupling is not really coming. And for Professor Wu, you have talked about, yeah, Cold War is happening. So I kind of see the contradicting ideas from here. So maybe two speakers may have spent time to answer this question. Thank you.
Thank you. The question about Cold War, whether or not it is a fact now. Your answer is positive and the other one is negative.
Well, I would say that we have entered into a new Cold War 2.0, but it is Cold War 2.0 and not Cold War 1.0, which means that this Cold War has some different features from the old one. And economic integration between the two main antagonists is a feature that the old Cold War did not have. The United States and the Soviet Union, they were not intertwined into, through market, trade, investment, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge difference between the two. And actually, I would say that in Cold War 2.0, because of this mutual economic integration, it may act as a suppressant on the possibility that the Cold War would evolve into a hot war. This being said, I would suggest that a lot of things that has been going on to try to distance the two big economies that has not happened in the past may act in an inadvertent way of reducing the incentive for two sides to keep peace. Because take for example, if China is being punished with that 145% tariff, whatever, or 245%, and that has not been removed, then that means that there will be stoppage of trade between these two entities. Then if China is thinking of invading Taiwan, then it's not going to suffer from American sanctions, right? Because the sanction has already been imposed. So the reduction of economic integration between United States and PRC actually serve an inadvertent effect, namely it will reduce the incentive for peace. It may not be a good thing for Taiwan. So a lot of people in Taiwan are saying that it's good, right? United States is having a trade war with China, and China is being beaten, it's being punished, and so on and so forth. But we have to understand that this is going to increase the incentive for China to use military force because they have nothing to lose.
Okay.
So this term Cold War 2.0, we hear more and more, but I wonder if another term, Teresa, thank you for your great question, it's a really interesting question, might be 有中国特色的冷战. In other words, be a kind of phrasing. Perhaps Deng Xiaoping would have called it that. Or a phrase actually by a really interesting, significant scholar of international relations from the mainland, Professor Wang Jisi of Beida, who says, it's not a Cold War, but a hot peace. That's an interesting expression, I think, as well. Let me just briefly comment, though, I think, on Professor Wu's very wise comment there, also about be careful what you wish for. One good thing about this most recent tariff agreement last week between the US and China is that it's the very rare example of what China always asks for, which is this famous Shuangying, the win-win scenario. Because both China and the US think they've won and say that they've won. And that may be good for the rest of us in that they're both able to tell that story. But I think that the wider issue of where this goes is not as simple as that. And I would say that if you had to choose one factor, you should choose a lot, but if you have to choose one factor that will shape whether or not that intertwining decouples or not, it's about technology. Technology and norms and standards. Right now, I was saying this at the end, I'll say it again, one of the large parts of the area where the battle, if it's a battle, will be won or lost, is in the global south. And right now, an awful lot of the embedded technology is Chinese. Huawei, ZTE, and other companies are providing 5G. They're providing the basis for Internet of Things, which will be the big story, I think, of the 2030s. And in general, I would say that China has done a pretty good job of creating an ecology in which its technology will underpin commerce, trade, and security issues for a long time. I believe some of the chips may come from Taiwan as well, but the technology is definitely mainland. It's not that the West and the US have already given up or have necessarily lost this competition. But I think right now, in terms of the kind of coordination of state and of private sector enterprise, as well as basic science research that China has managed to put together, the West is not as coordinated. It's doing better on some individual things. I think in AI and in life sciences, you can still see that overall, what the wider liberal world is doing, if you call it liberal world, is still ahead. But in terms of coordinating those efforts, China, I think, so far has actually probably got a stronger position. And that's where the competition, the struggle, even the battle, if you want to call it that, I think will be resolved in the next 10 or 15 years.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Oh, we have so many hands. The lady in the center, yes.
Thank you to Professor Mitter and Professor Wu. We have enjoyed your excellent insights, and thank you very much. And my question is on Taiwan. I'd love to hear more about your comments, because you have mentioned that from the recent elections from many countries, the liberal tendency has been elected out. Okay. And however, the current regime in Taiwan has been more liberal. So I wonder whether there's any chance that might change in Taiwan. I wonder how you think about that. And then also, I don't know whether Professor Mitter has also observed the development in Taiwan, the government and all that closely. And so I just wondered from what is happening in Taiwan, whether we have somehow the government has focusing on the inside domestic ideology, the combat on all the thoughts that they are pro-independence and so on, and we have lost many important opportunities that globally that's happening right now. We are not really head on and dealing with it. And do you think that we might actually have lost a lot of opportunities, actually? Just want to hear how you thought about that.
Okay, thank you. A question for you.
Yes, although I think that Professor Wu, as the great political scientist, should really comment on this too. But very briefly, I'd say thank you for your question. I think Taiwan's journey to democracy is one that actually is much better known in the outside world than many people realize. And I will say explicitly that I teach a section on it to my class at the Harvard Kennedy School, because understanding that very complex history that comes from the end of the Second World War, the development of the ROC on Taiwan in a situation where the economy obviously improves during the Cold War, but the politics becomes very contentious, the movement towards democratization and final democratization in the 80s and 90s, and then where we are today. This is a complex story that didn't come just from nowhere, and I feel that more people should understand it. One of the great benefits, the great benefit that emerged in Taiwan, and also I would say in South Korea and other countries that went through that process, is the emergence of a liberal multi-party democracy with a free civil society, free press, and all the other elements of a truly liberal society. That is historically a very, very hard thing to develop, and it's even harder to maintain in many ways. I'm glad to say that my own sense, and I'm an amateur on those aspects of Taiwan, but comparatively speaking, some liberal democracies have certainly in recent years turned in a direction which is, pretty illiberal in all sorts of ways. Here in Taiwan for the moment, it does seem that although there are aspects of a more confrontational politics, the basic system which has been so hard won, and the atmosphere, in the end, you could say that 民主不是一个系统，是一个精神, and I think that that spirit is still very, very lively here, regardless of which political party you support, or maybe you don't support any particular party at all, but it's easy to lose as well. So I would say that not least when talking to China, making sure that that spirit of pluralist democracy is something that everyone associates with Taiwan, and Taiwan thinks it's part of its own identity, is an absolutely core task. But then I'm just a foreigner, so I don't claim any expertise on this. I'd love to hear Professor Wu, who knows this really well from the inside.
Again, I fully agree with Professor Mitter. It's democracy in Taiwan came with a lot of effort, and it's really very difficult for us to maintain democratic because we are facing overwhelming threat from across the Taiwan Strait. I always observed an inverse relationship between the degree of threat, external threat, and the degree of liberal democracy, which means that if you are a liberal democracy when it finds itself in a war, for example, would have to restrict freedoms of its citizens because it's fighting for its existence. On the other hand, if you have a peaceful environment, then obviously there can be a lot of freedoms, and it would be very difficult for the government to try to encroach on individual freedoms without the justification of safeguarding national security. Now, the problem we are facing is exactly what I have just mentioned. Namely, we are facing a rising threat from across the Taiwan Strait. I mean, the missiles, the aircraft and the carrier, they are real. So a lot of people are sensing this national security urgency. And the government has taken actions to protect the security of the country. But then the problem is, we are different from mainland China because we are a liberal democracy and they are a totalitarian, post-totalitarian, authoritarian system. So the major difference between us is that we have freedoms and liberties and they don't have. And this is our greatest appeal, our soft power. Now, the problem is, how much liberties do we have to sacrifice in order to protect our liberties? How much freedom do we need to give up for the security of our free society? So nowadays, when the government is making that decision, a lot of people will simply say that it's too much. You've restricted our freedoms way beyond what is justified by the security situation of the country. So there will be a lot of debate. And this is a very difficult trade-off. And I think the mature way to do that is for the government, for the society, for the opposition, to have an open forum to discuss, look, we have those MiGs, we have those aircrafts from the PLA circling the island, missiles zooming over our heads. What are the concrete actions that should be taken at this particular moment? I think we are generally in lack of this very honest public forum to discuss these matters. So whenever the government is taking specific action, there will be protest because, we are a free democracy and we need to preserve our liberties. And the government is saying that we are restricting a specific person's liberty for the purpose of preserving the overall freedom of the country. And then the opposition and the society will reply, why do we trust your calculation? So this is a very touchy issue, and I think we need to have an open spirit and an open forum to frankly discuss this. I think that's what we need right now.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time, but I would like to take the final question from that gentleman over there. You raised your hand.
Both distinguished professors. I would like to switch to perhaps a lighter subject. I don't think we can talk about changing a world order without talking about the reserve currency. So I would like to know your views on US dollar's future as a reserve currency and what might be the alternatives for both gentlemen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
So afterwards, when it's over, you and me can have a little talk about a crypto deal I can offer you. I would say that you can't replace something with nothing. And the reality is that even if there's turbulence in the way in which the dollar is managed, and of course we're all looking to see what happens probably next year when Jerome Powell's term as chair of the Fed is up and there will be a new Fed chairman appointed. Here's a bet I'll give you now. You can call me back in a year's time if this turns out to be wrong. I think actually the body of people who sit at the top of economic decision making in the administration realize very well how important it is to keep global faith in the dollar. And my strong suspicion, just as in the first term, President Trump appointed a guy called Jerome Powell as the chairman of the Fed, who's turned out to be pretty mainstream. I suspect that something quite similar will happen this time round. But let's just say that there is a wider sense globally that somehow or other the dollar doesn't have the standing that it did. I don't think it's going to be easy to find a replacement anytime soon. In terms of other global currencies, I mean, the euro, still people hold far smaller reserves of it, and B, there are still complexities within the European Central Bank that mean that there are vestiges of doubt about quite where it's going to go and how it holds together. The renminbi, as long as China keeps its capital account closed, is not going to be an internationally tradable currency, and people are not going to put very large amounts of holdings into it, although there's more renminbi in general in people's holdings. I think people are looking in some rather old-fashioned directions. People talk about gold, and people also talk about the way in which certain types of digital currency and other vehicles might be used. But to finish the thought, if you're going to ask me, will the dollar still be the dominant global reserve currency in 5 years' time? I think the answer is almost certainly yes. Will it be the dominant global currency in 10 years' time? I think that's still pretty likely. The proportion of dollar holdings may be relatively lower, but I don't think there's going to be anything I can see now that's going to be a single obvious replacement for it.
Okay. Thank you. Lisa?
Again, I fully agree with Professor Mitter. I think the US dollar is going to be still the main reserve currency. The only thing that may change, I think, is the exchange rate. Because as long as the dollar remains the international reserve currency, then there will be a lot of interest in holding the US dollar. And so when the US is running trade deficit, then the US dollar will not decline in its exchange rate because there are other reasons, reserve reasons, and so on and so forth to keep US dollars. And because of that reason, I think a lot of people actually are thinking this way. The US dollar is kept artificially strong. So given the fact that the dollar remains to be a very strong reserve currency, then you cannot trust the free market to reflect the huge US trade deficit that it is currently suffering from. And so it needs to have the government to move in, to change, to engineer a depreciated dollar to make America products more competitive internationally. This is what they did in 1985 in Taka, right? And this is what they did with New Taiwan dollar in 1987. And I think they are aiming at exactly that. So if there are wild fluctuations of the exchange rate of the currencies of America's major trading partners vis-a-vis the US dollar, I won't be surprised. And actually, we have just experienced some kind of shock, right? And that kind of things may very well happen in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for your responses. I would like to thank two speakers for their wonderful presentation, and I would like to thank you for all your participation to the event. I think the Fairwind Foundation will continue to organize some very important and interesting lectures or forums, and you are all very much welcome to join us. Thank you again.
It's time for group photo. It's time for group photo. We take the photo in two parts.接着，请长风基金会的董事以及长风领袖营的学员们，我们来到台前，一起跟讲者合影。